Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming together to immerse ourselves in these relationships and this wisdom that we call Torah. This week is a little bit unusual in terms of our Torah portion. It's one of those times of the year when part of the Jewish world is maybe out of sync with other parts of the Jewish world in terms of the Torah readings, because we have Israel and the Reform movement will be reading a weekly Torah portion on Shabbat this Saturday. Those outside of the land of Israel who observe a more traditional practice, Saturday will be the 8th day of Passover, so they will be reading the appropriate reading for the 8th day of Passover. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to read half of Acharei Mot, and then the following week we'll be reading the second half of Acharei Mot, and then the whole Jewish world will be in sync once again, because next week is when everyone will be reading some or all of Acharei Mot. So we are going to read a part of Acharei Mot, which is in the book of Leviticus, beginning with chapter 16, verse 1, and we'll read through chapter 17, verse 16, and then we'll finish up that portion next week. So now if you'd like to go ahead and unmute together, we can recite our blessing for this moment of being together in the body of this wisdom. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher tishanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asor divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for the opportunity of immersing ourselves in words, deeds, and relationships of Torah. Leviticus chapter 16, verse 1. We'll read through the English translation of our portion. I'll share with you a little bit of a focused study about it, and then we'll open up our collaborative conversation about it. Let me share with you the opening verses. Adonai spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron, who died when they drew too close to the presence of Adonai. Adonai said to Moses, "Tell your brother Aaron that he is not to come at will into the shrine behind the curtain, in front of the cover that is upon the ark, lest he die. For I appear in the cloud over the cover." We're now on verse 3, and Margot, would you like to read a few verses there, starting at verse 3?
Thus only shall Aaron enter the shrine with a bull of the herd for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He shall be dressed in sacro linen and a sacro linen tunic, with linen breeches next to his flesh, and be girt with a linen sash. He shall wear a linen turban. They are sacral vestments. He shall bathe his body in water and then put them on. And from the Israelite community, he shall take 2 goats for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering.
Thank you so much, Margot. Let me invite June. Would you like to pick up from there?
Shall present the bullock of the sin offering, which is for himself, and make atonement for himself and for his house. And he shall take the 2 goats and set them before the Lord at the door of the tent of the meeting. And Aaron shall cast lots upon the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord and the other lot for Azazel. And Aaron shall present the goat upon which the lot fell for the Lord and offer him for a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be set alive before the Lord to make atonement over him, to send him away for Azazel into the wilderness.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Let me invite Al and Rita. Would you like to read a few verses starting at verse 11?
Aaron shall then offer his bull of purgation offering to make expiation for himself and his household. He shall slaughter his bull of a purgation offering, and he shall take a panful of glowing coals scooped from the altar before the Eternal, and 2 handfuls of finely ground aromatic incense, and bring this behind the curtain. He shall put the incense on the fire before the Eternal, so that the cloud from the incense screens the cover that is over the ark, the pact, lest he die. He shall take some of the blood of the bull and sprinkle it with his finger over the cover on the east side, and in front of the cover he shall sprinkle some of the blood with his finger 7 times. He shall then slaughter the people's goat of purgation offering, bring its blood behind the curtain, and do with its blood as he has done with the blood of the bull. He shall sprinkle it over the cover and in front of the cover.
Thank you. Rita, do you want to read?
No,
If you can't read, Rabbi.
Okay. Okay, very good. David and Susan, would you like to begin there at verse 16?
Go. Yes, thank you.
Only now I lost my place.
16.
Okay, and it is, and he shall slaughter, he shall slaughter the offense offering goat, which is the people's, and bring its blood within the.
This is 16. Thus he shall purge the shrine of the.
Next verse.
Oh, was I in the wrong verse?
Yeah.
And he shall atone over the sacred zone for the uncleannesses of the Israelites and for their sins, according to all their offenses. And thus he shall do for the tent of meeting that dwells with them in the midst of their uncleanness.
And no human shall be in front of the tent of meeting when he comes to make atonement and the holy until he comes out. And he shall make atonement for him and for his house and for all the community of Israel. And he shall go out to the altar that is in front of Hashem and make atonement over it. And he shall take some of the bull's blood and some of the goat's blood and put it on the altar's horns and all around. And he shall sprinkle some of the blood on it with his finger 7 times and purify it and make it holy from the impurities of the children of Israel.
Thank you. Let me invite Paul. Would you like to pick up at verse, I believe it's 20?
Thank you, Rabbi. When he is finished atoning for the sanctuary, the tent of the meeting, and the altar, he shall bring the living he-goat near. Aaron shall lean his 2 hands upon the head of the living he-goat and confess upon it all the iniquities of the children of Israel and their rebellious sins among all their sins, and place them upon the head of the he-goat, and send it with a designated man to the desert. The he-goat will bear upon itself all their iniquities to an uninhabited land, and he should send the he-goat to the desert.
Thank you, Paul. Let me invite Justin. Would you like to read a little bit at that point?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Verse 23.
Yes.
And Aaron shall enter the tent of meeting and remove the linen garments that he had worn when he came into the holy, and there he shall store them away. And he shall immerse his flesh in a holy place and don his garments. He shall then go out and sacrifice his burnt offering and the people's burnt offering he shall effect atonement for himself and for the people. And he shall cause the fat of the sin offering to go up in smoke upon the altar. And the person who sent off the he-goat to Azazel shall immerse his garments and immerse his flesh in water, and after this he may come into the camp.
Thank you so much, Justin. Robin, would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 27?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. The bull of purgation offering and the goat of purgation offering, whose blood was brought in to purge the shrine, shall be taken outside the camp, and their hides, flesh, and dung shall be consumed in fire. The one who burned them shall wash those clothes and bathe the body in water, and after that may re-enter the camp. And thus shall be to you a law for all time. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall practice self-denial. You shall do no manner of work, neither the citizen nor the alien who resides among you. For on this day atonement shall be made for you to purify you of all your sins. You shall be pure before Adonai. It shall be a Sabbath of complete rest for you, and you shall practice self-denial. It is a law for all time. The priest who has been anointed and ordained to serve as priest in place of his father shall make expiation. He shall put on the linen vestments, the sacral vestments. He shall purge the innermost shrine. He shall purge the tent of meeting and the altar, and he shall make expiation for the priests and for all the people of the congregation. This shall be to you a law for all time, to make atonement for the Israelites for all their sins once a year. And Moses did as Adonai had commanded him.
Thank you so much. And Jim, would you like to read a little bit at the very start of chapter 17?
Thank you, Rabbi. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and his sons and to all the Israelite people, and say to them, this is what Adonai has commanded. If any one of the house of Israel slaughters an ox or sheep or goat in the camp or does so outside the camp and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to present it as an offering to Adonai before Adonai's tabernacle, blood offering to Adonai, blood guilt shall be imputed to that man. He has shed blood, that man shall be cut off from among his people. This is in order that the Israelites may bring the sacrifices which they have been making in the open, that they may bring them before Adonai to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and offer them as sacrifices of well-being to Adonai, that the priest may dash the blood against the altar of Adonai at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and turn the fat into smoke as a pleasing odor to Adonai, and that they may offer their sacrifices no more to the goat demons after whom they stray. This shall be to them a law for all times throughout the ages.
Thank you so much, Jim. And Bill and Wendy, would you like to read a little bit?
Oops. Say to them further, if any one of the house of Israel or of the strangers who reside among them offers a burnt offering or a sacrifice and does not bring it into the entrance of the tent of meeting to offer it to the Lord, that person shall be cut off from his people.
And if anyone of the house of Israel or of the strangers who reside among them partakes of any blood, I will set my face against the person who partakes of the blood, and I will cut him off from among his kin. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have assigned it to you for making expiation for your lives upon the altar. It is the blood as life that effects expiation. Therefore, I say to the Israelite people, No person among you shall partake of blood, nor shall the stranger who resides among you partake of blood.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. Let me invite Dave. Would you like to read there, beginning at verse 13?
And if any Israelite or stranger who resides among them hunts down an animal or a bird that may be eaten, that person shall pour out its blood and cover it with earth. For the life of all the flesh, its blood is its life. Therefore I say to the Israelite people, you should not partake of the blood of any flesh, for the life of all flesh is in the blood. Anyone who partakes of it shall be cut off.
Thank you, Dave. Let me invite Catherine. Would you like to read at verse 15?
Thank you, Rabbi. Any person, whether citizen or stranger, who eats what has died or has been torn by beasts shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. Then he shall be clean. But if he does not wash his clothes and bathe his body, he shall bear his guilt.
Thank you, Catherine. And that is our portion that we'll be reading this week. We'll finish Acharei Mot. Next week, I'd like to share with you a little bit of focus study, and then we'll open it up for our collaborative conversation. If you have a copy of the study sheet, I invite you to take it out at this point. I've entitled this week's study session, To Infinity and Beyond. And we're going to explore a little bit the notion about to infinity and what kind of a number, if anything, that is. In my weekly email, I mentioned that, of course, this phrase to infinity beyond is famous for many of us in popular culture because of the movie Toy Story. Buzz Lightyear, that's his catchphrase, to infinity and beyond. But it was also an Israeli mathematician, Eli Meor, who wrote a book called To Infinity and Beyond that was written, I believe, about 9 years before Toy Story, in which he explored the impact of the very notion of infinity on both mathematics and art. So we're going to explore a little bit this notion about counting and the notion about infinity. And what I'm really intrigued by is the name of our Torah portion, Acharei Mot, which means after death. And in this particular case, it's referring to a very specific death, the death of Aaron's two sons. But the whole notion about after death, might there be something after death? What is after death? And so we're going to explore this notion about what does after death mean, and what is the lesson that's being offered here. Remember, this year we've been looking at the book of Leviticus, not so much in terms of the exclusive set of rules and privileges it provides the priestly class, but I was suggesting that perhaps it's really meant to offer each one of us, no matter what family or tribe we're born into, some wisdom about a spiritual practice designed to help us live more fulfilling and wholly oriented lives. When we're talking about death, it's also helpful to remember that in the rabbinic scheme of purity and impurity, as it's teased out of Torah, that at one end of the spectrum, that is the impure end of the spectrum, death is the most impure experience and quality, and life is the purest and the holiest. And that's not a medical or a biological reference. I think what it's referring to is that death is that experience, not just those who have their biology come to an end, but more importantly, those who come in contact with death. The capacity of death, the sense of finitude, the sense of mortality, how disturbing that can be, and how it can cause us to end all hopefulness. It can cause us to bring to an abrupt halt any sense of forward movement in our lives. And so that's what is meant, I think, by the notion of impurity, that it's taking us away from the mission that has been given to us by the source of our life, which is to live and to make life itself holy, more full of life. Okay. So this is the context in which to begin reading this notion about after death, because after all, it is focusing initially on Aaron, as our opening verses say. On the study sheet, God spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron. So Aaron has now experienced this most horrific experience that a parent can endure, which is the death of two children. How can he continue to move forward in life? What value can life continue to offer now that his children are gone, they're dead? And so we're going to explore to see what is it that's being offered here to Aaron. And what we read in the text is God says, tell your brother Aaron. And then what follows after that are a series of prescriptions of things that Aaron is to do. Very discrete, clear steps that Aaron is to take. And these are steps having to do with responsibilities that he has, and their responsibilities for the welfare of the rest of the community in performing these various ritual acts. So I want to explore this notion about how do we deal with death? And it is interesting that this conversation is occurring within the context of the holiday that we're still observing at this moment, which is Passover. And Passover, we celebrate. We celebrate this sense of freedom, of forward movement, of escaping the death chambers and the death culture of Egypt. And so we're joyful and we're happy, and we bring everyone around the table and we sing songs. When we read the story of the Exodus carefully, we'll see that there are actually some sub-stories having to do with loss and death. And I want to explore those a little bit. So in number 2 on the study sheet, we go back into the story of the Exodus, and this is from the book of Exodus, chapter 14, verse 5. It was reported to Pharaoh that the people had fled, and Pharaoh and his servants had a change of heart toward the people. And they said, what is this that we have done, that we have released Israel from serving us? It is if there is some awareness of the people of Egypt, the entire culture, that something has happened that is now going to catastrophically change their culture and their way of life. The loss of slavery means that what they have been used to, how they have been living, has now come to an end. It's a form of deep loss, and one might even say impending death of their culture. And it causes a great anxiety, a great fear among them. And what they want to do is now reclaim that which they've lost, to bring it back, if you will, into Egypt, to restore the culture and the way of life that was familiar to them and which they relied upon. So what's interesting is that the commentaries to this verse all signify that this event, this recognition, happens and then is immediately followed by the moment at the sea, which commentaries tell us happens on the 7th day from the Exodus from Egypt. So this is what Rashi says. On the night preceding the 7th, they went down into the sea. In the morning of the 7th day, the Israelites recited the song of the sea. Therefore, we read the song on the 7th day. That is the 7th day of Passover. At sundown here, we are observing the seventh day of Passover. And so this is, according to this bit of commentary, this is what's happening on the seventh day. They're at the Red Sea, and the Egyptians are now coming to reclaim and bring back the slaves to Egypt, because they can't bear the idea that things are coming to an end. Ibn Ezra, a medieval commentator, makes it very clear. He says, the seventh day is the day of Pharaoh's drowning and being rendered powerless. To stop, if you'll notice at the very top of the study sheet, I indicate that this is, in one tradition, Shevi'i Shel Pesach, the seventh day of the holiday of Passover. But it's not really. According to the Bible, Passover was just one day. It was the day in which the Paschal lamb was offered up. What follows here, if you look at number 3, this notion about Passover and 7 days, Exodus chapter 12. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. You shall celebrate a sacred occasion on the first day and a sacred occasion on the 7th day. Now, if one is reading all this material according to the way Rashi and Ibn Ezra want us to read it, what we're focusing on the 7th day is this moment at the Red Sea, which either one can read as a moment of the climax of liberation, the crossing of the Red Sea, the triumph of the Israelites in their escape from Egypt, or you can see it as the drowning and the death of the Egyptians. But when we look at number 12, chapter 12, verses 15 through 16, what we see here is the 7 days, the seventh day being proclaimed a sacred occasion, precedes all this, the narrative about what takes place at the Red Sea. It says, you shall celebrate 7 days of Chag HaMatzot. This is really 7 days of unleavened bread, not so much the 7 days of the day of Passover. And so the question is, well, what is Chag HaMatzot? What is this observance about 7 days focused on the unleavened bread, on the suppression or cleansing ourselves, rather, of the chametz, that which puffs us up? So I'd like to just continue a little bit more about, we have just encountered this notion about the Egyptians experiencing this terror of this traumatic loss of in their culture, which amounts to kind of a death of their culture. And now we're going to encounter something similar happening to the Israelites. And here in Exodus chapter 14, as Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites cried out, "What have you done to us?" It is as if there is this parallel fear that the Israelites are now having to what the Egyptians had. The Egyptians were experiencing this terrible loss, and all of a sudden, the Israelites are now experiencing their own kind of fear, a kind of fear of the death of something that they were familiar with. And now they're either terrified to move forward, or they're terrified about staying where they are, or they want to return. So it is interesting that at this moment, if you turn over, we have this midrash that says there were 4 camps into which the Israelites were divided. The number 4 is a key number in our Seder service. We have 4 glasses of wine. We have 4 questions. We have 4 children. We have 4 different definitions about what constitutes freedom. So here again, we have this number 4 that's being brought up within our tradition, having to do with this moment. And so the Midrash Mechilta says that when the Israelites cried out, "What have you done to us?" there were actually 4 different groups who are expressing a different level of anxiety and a different response to that anxiety. So this is what the Midrash says. One group said, "Let's throw ourselves into the sea." And by that, they don't mean something suicidal. What they're referring to by the sea is a sea of piety, a sea of learning, a sea of Talmud. In other words, let's cut off all contact with the world around us, which is so impure and so tainted. Let's just ignore the rest of the world and let's just cut ourselves off from it and immerse ourselves in a very insular world. So that's one response. The second response, according to the Midrash, is a group that says, "Let's return to Egypt." And of course, this is the group that says, it was a nice idea, this promised land thing. It was a little pie in the sky. It was kind of unrealistic. So let's just lower our expectations. After all, look at how big those walls are. Look at how huge those pyramids are. Look at how resplendent the Pharaoh is. Look at all the chariots and weapons they have. We need to dial back what we can expect to achieve in life. And then there's a group that says, no, let's wage war on the Egyptians. And so this is a group that says, well, it's wrong. Your first group is wrong to want to isolate themselves from the rest of the world. The second group is wrong to want to just submit to the power of the world around them. We can fight the world that is opposed to us. And then there's a fourth group that says, let us pray to God. And this is a group, according to Midrash, that is saying the rest of you, the other 3 groups, you're all dealing with the realities of the material world, and you're responding to the material world in different ways. But there's another dimension to reality beyond the material world, and that's the one that we should spend our time seeking to access, which is through prayer, because prayer can bring about great things. It's interesting within the Hasidic tradition, these different 4 archetypes of responses to the Egyptians coming to reclaim them. And it's very fascinating that the first group, which says, let's isolate ourselves and just ignore the rest of the world, which is so impure. There is, and Paul will be able to help me with the Yiddish, but there's a phrase, tzaddik in peltz, which is means
a righteous person in fur.
Yes, a righteous person. Yes, a righteous person in a fur coat. That's how the Hasidim refer to this first group, which wants to just, all they want to do is insulate themselves from the rest of the world. This notion about a tzaddik in a fur coat means tzaddik, a righteous man, wraps himself in a fur coat because it's cold. And someone says to him, there's another way you could stay warm, which is to light a fire. And if you light a fire, there's a chance that other people could be warm too, not just yourself. But the tzaddik in a fur coat says, that's so unrealistic. And all I can really do is just keep myself warm, and the rest of the world has to worry about itself. So it's a way to kind of criticize this insular approach. And then the second category that we saw about let us return to Egypt that's denoted as someone with a slave mentality. Let us wage war on the Egyptians is the warrior mentality. And then The fourth is let us pray to God is the spiritualist category. All of these are critiqued in the Midrash by Rabbi Yeshua, who says, look, the Holy Blessed One said to Moses, all that Israel has to do is go forward. This notion about going forward in the face of trauma and death and loss is what the Midrash is trying to share with us, and I think is part of the message of this Torah portion, that you can become immobilized by one's encounter with death, by one's encounter with catastrophic loss. And what you need to do is to figure out how to take steps forward. The more that you move forward, the more that you'll be able to distance yourself from the trauma of death. So I want to share with you a poem that captures some of this. And it's a poem that's written by Nellie Sachs. And a little bit about the Nellie Sachs, if you're not familiar with her. Nellie Sachs was born in Berlin in December of 1891. She was born into really an upper middle class Jewish family, which had become fully assimilated into German life. They had abandoned Jewish tradition. They lived quite well until 1930, when her father dies. And then in 1934, the Nuremberg laws resulted in the loss of their property and their freedoms. The family lost their home. And then when it was becoming clear that even worse awaited them in Nazi Germany, Nellie Sachs and her mother were able to flee to Sweden. In fact, they were on the last plane from Berlin to Sweden. They lived in Sweden quite at a poverty level. Nellie began to write poetry. In 1950, her mother died, and she then began to return. Nellie then began to return to her Jewish roots. She embraced Judaism. She became quite familiar and friendly with Martin Buber. She studied the Zohar, Jewish mysticism, and in 1966 she published a very significant body of poetry, which this particular poem that I'm going to share with you was published in. And in 1966, she won the Nobel Prize for Literature. So this is a woman who lost a lot, who was able to just barely escape Nazi Germany. And she wrote this poem called, "But Perhaps God Needs the Longing." But perhaps God needs the longing, wherever else should it dwell, which with kisses and tears and sighs fills mysterious spaces of air, and perhaps is invisible soil from which roots of stars grow and swell, and the radiant voice across fields of parting which calls to reunion there. Oh, my beloved, perhaps in the sky of longing, worlds have been born of our love, just as our breathing in and out builds a cradle for life and death. We are grains of sand, dark and farewell, lost in birth's secret treasure trove. Around us already, perhaps future moons, suns, and stars blaze in a fiery wreath. In this poem, Nellie Sachs is contending with the inevitability of death. And what do we do with that? And what she is saying, as I read it in this poem, is that how we deal with the inevitability of death can either increase darkness in our world, or it can create more light. And the nature of longing that she refers to, but perhaps God needs the longing. There's a very fascinating article that a man named Johannes Endereg wrote called Nellie Sachs, The Poem and Transformation. He focuses on the word longing, and he says, longing can either be an attempt to get what we don't have, or it can be, as he says it is in Nellie Sachs' poem, an expression of being underway, a sense of movement that overcomes gravity. And I want to suggest that's what's happening here with God and Aaron. The spiritual message to Aaron is, you can either crumble and fall into the abyss of loss and despair and create a black hole, if you will, in the world around you, or you can find some way to transcend this moment, to move through it. This notion about longing is an expression of being underway, rather than trying to possess what one does not have. That's what that was the Egyptians' response to their sense of death and loss, was we need to get what we don't have. And in a sense, that's the four archetypes that our Midrash refers to, the Israelites, is they're kind of chaotically reaching for something to fill a void, rather than seeking to merely, as God says in the Torah, all you need to do is move forward. I want to acknowledge that tonight, on the day 6, that is, of the counting of the Omer, is what we call combining two of the Sephardic aspects in Kabbalah, that is Yesod of Chesed. And Chesed is this outpouring, this free giving of love. And Yesod, within the structure of Kabbalah, is in the middle, towards the bottom, and it connotes a sense of bonding, of foundation. And when you combine it with love, it is a way of anchoring love, so that it serves some purpose, some sense of focus, some sense of commitment and attachment, rather than just being spread out and dispersed. The notion of Yesod is significant because it really is the bottom, is really the penultimate in the link of the chain of Sephardic attributes within the Kabbalistic system. It is really the channel through which all these other energies flow, and then they flow into the final emanation called Malchut, which is that which is present here in this dimension, the sense of sovereignty, the sense of the feminine presence of God. So Yesod is really the channel through which everything flows. It unites the top and the bottom, what's above and what's below. There's a very beautiful verse from Proverbs, in chapter 10, which uses the word Yesod and combines it with the notion of what a true tzaddik is all about. When the storm passes the wicked is no more, and the tzaddik is an everlasting yesod, foundation. When the storm passes, the wicked is no more, and the tzaddik is an everlasting yesod. Yesod as the channel through which all the supernal energies flow into this world. That's what a tzaddik is supposed to do. Tzaddik is supposed to be someone who is merely a channel for a reciprocity of energy to flow through, from below to above and from above to below. That's all. So I want to say a word about our artist of the evening. And then we'll go back to our ancestor Aaron. On the front is a painting by Mark Rothko. Mark Rothko was born in Russia, came with his family as a young child, grew up in Portland, Oregon, and then became one of the great artists in the 20th century. And he went through several phases. His first phase was that of trying to represent on the canvas what he saw with his eye. And then he shifted into trying to express more the emotions that the subjects that he saw were feeling, a form of expressionism. And that's the painting that's on this page is from that period. It's a painting, one of several that he did, of the subway system. And there you can see people waiting on a subway platform. You have 4 pillars. And here the figures are very squished. They're very compressed figures. And it almost as if they are somehow trapped, some of them actually trapped between these bars, these posts that almost look as if they are jail bars. But these are very constrained, alienated beings. He moved from this kind of work in the 40s, shifted to more surrealistic work, where the actual recognizable human figure became so morphed and diluted and disrupted into non-recognized biomorphic forms that were intended to represent mythic images or expressions of the subconscious. And then his final phase, which perhaps you're most familiar with, are these floating fields of color, blocks of color. And by that point in his time, they achieve for him some kind of way of expressing his contact with something that was transcendent and sublime. And these fields of color that he has in his final periods of work are designed to be contemplative, emotive, spiritual, ephemeral, and yet heavily present. They were his way of kind of sharing with us some recording of a contact he made with something that was beyond both what he saw with his eye, something that he even experienced beyond mere emotion, something that went even beyond the subconscious, something that made contact with that which is transcendent, sublime, and beyond. So I go back to our ancestor Aaron and suggest that this is what is happening with Aaron, is that he is being taught something seemingly quite simple and yet difficult to achieve without a community of practice, perhaps. And that is what his brother Moses provides for him, a company, a community of practice. God says, tell your brother Aaron, move forward, observe these rituals, take these steps, do this for your community. It needs you. And these are the words that God instructed Moses to tell the Israelites when they became so stuck on the shore of the Red Sea. All you need to do is move forward, take a step into the water. In her poem, Nellie Sachs is reminding us that death is inevitable, but with death, there's also a cycle of renewed life. And we can be a part of that, depending upon how we approach the loss. Oh, my beloved, perhaps in the sky of longing, worlds have been born of our love, just as our breathing in and out builds a cradle for life and death. We are grains of sand, dark with farewell, lost in birth's secret treasure trove. Around us already, perhaps, future moons, suns, and stars blaze in a fiery wreath. With that, I'd love to hear what you've thought about in this week's Torah portion. I'm happy to extend our conversational time because you were so generous in allowing me to extend my time with you in my focus study. So if you'd like to share something, please raise your hand. I'd love to call upon you. Paul.
Yeah, I'm going to go right from the poem that Nellie Sachs wrote, that the woman seems to have a really good feel for death and how to handle it. And on the other hand, when you start out in the first line and also in the previous parshat, where they talk about when the two sons of Aaron go kaput, how that affects Aaron, how it affects the Israelis, the nation, but it never talks about how it affects, the mother. The mother, through all these, the last time I skipped that point because there weren't that many ladies, but now they're represented here properly. But I already know the answer because I've been around, for long enough with this group to know that it's a question that I don't need to have answered. It's already been answered in the past.
Thank you, Paul. And others? Okay. Susan? Go ahead and unmute, Susan.
Recently, a friend told me that her granddaughter was having to have surgery to have a tube removed from her ear that had not come out and should have. And the doctor said that she was going to take out her adenoids at the same time because she only breathes through her mouth. And this is about a 7-year-old girl. And she said, I like breathing through my mouth. And then she had the surgery. And about a week later, she was talking with her grandmother. And her grandmother said, well, how do you feel? And she said, Grandma, I can breathe through my nose now. I really like it. And it just reminded me of how we get stuck. We're comfortable with what we know, and it's sometimes harder to move on, even though moving on will benefit.
Thanks, Susan. I think we're experiencing that a lot culturally these days about the fear of moving on or the fear of things changing. Yeah, thank you. Richard, and then Justin.
Thank you, Rabbi. Some time ago, you talked about Leviticus as being a new dimension. The party's over, the trip is over, and now something else is going on. And we've talked about getting rid of ego. And I thought this week that, if you didn't have an ego, you couldn't build a house. That there has to be some balance as long as we're alive to get to know that inner light that's in there by quietude or prayer, but also to be able to negotiate the peace that we look for in the world. And the idea of longing to me is the idea of the infinity you're talking about seems to me very much when the waters parted and we went across, we were underwater. And the idea is we arrived back on the land and now we're given some rules and some structure to use our ego to follow these rules so we can form community. And mankind struggles to do that now. You have a lot of arms going to Ukraine from all kinds of places, but not a lot of learning to be civil with one another within a culture. And that's really tenuous now. And this reminds us, this is a chance to try and learn softness and to learn community. And the longing or the hope that we're on a ship and, just over the horizon is the Statue of Liberty or whatever it is we're going for. And it's not something we need. It's just where we're going. And I can't believe that this Torah portion is named Acharei Mot only because it's about the death of these children. But it was a convenient place to say, okay, you're across the river, and now we're going to tell you about after death. And it has to do about developing your longing because it's there. And while you're here, you have a job to do. So, and this will help you do it, these structures. So I thought it was a nice portion, and I liked your very much liked your waltz through it.
Thank you. And you reminded me to the focus about it is the notion of stopping is a form of death in and of itself. And I don't just mean I'm stopping to live in New York City or Long Beach or wherever. It has to do with stopping with one's own development and to imagine that one is limited in what one can become, that's a form of death in and of itself. And so this whole notion about continuing to move is so key to the Torah and the rabbinic notion of what is holy. And let me call upon Justin, and then we'll ask Catherine, and then we'll get to Margot.
I think I'll just keep on this one. I mean, this parsha offers us an opportunity to look at, as we're saying, if it is Acharei Mot, then after this death, what we're seeing again is intensive sacrificial acts in order to attempt a reconstellation of the sacred whole. And I just in looking at this, I mean, I just was wondering, and maybe this is out of this, is of course dealing with after death, then there's what? Blame and atonement. A lot of blame and this attempts at atonement. But in this also this scapegoat, literally the passage on the scapegoat, and then what is that? It's Kaf Aleph 31, which is what it's Bayad Ish Iti Hamid Barach, that the goat is taken off by some person of the desert or a timely person of the desert. And I'm trying to understand that, what's the meaning of that line? Not only is the scapegoat sort of just sent off, but somebody carries that off with them. So I'm just putting that out there. What is this line about? What is this?
Justin, you've inspired me. I think I'm going to follow up a little bit more on both the goat, the notion of Acharei Mot, which I'm now in my mind. Next week, I'm going to translate that word very differently, and when we explore the rest of the portion, and this notion about going off to Azazel, something out into the wilderness. Is it something that will just take everything away that needs to be taken away. It is quite fascinating. And what's also from a cultural point of view or an anthropological point of view, it's also interesting to know that there were cultures that were simultaneous with the Israelite ancient culture that had a horrible ritual of having a human being run a gauntlet through a community, and that human being would be struck and whipped, and that person would be punished, and that punishment would relieve the community of all of its sins. And so this seems to be a repurposing of what the Israelite culture had experienced in hopefully, with a different way of understanding that it wasn't that punishing another human being wasn't going to resolve the problems. But I'm gonna explore that. You've inspired me to explore that with something out of Genesis that you've kind of provoked in me. So we'll do that next week. Thank you. Catherine, yeah, go ahead, Catherine.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah.
I have two sort of disjointed thoughts. One has to do with the return to the idea that blood is life in the Parshat, of not consuming blood, but somehow trying to preserve blood, preserve the blood after the death. So that was one thought. And the other thought has to do with the artwork itself, which is very interesting because I associate Rothko with abstraction. And here we see these figures that are so thin that they're almost abstract. And so it's sort of in this borderline between being full figured and being and blending into the surroundings.
Yeah.
And waning.
Yeah.
Waning of the human figure.
Yeah. I mean, all the artists in the expressionist world address the notion of the represented figure, but it's so clear in Rothko's work, this shift from having clear identifiable objects and figures, and then eventually they morph or they dissolve into something that is not recognizable through our eyes, but becomes recognizable through some other experience that we have. And that's what his fields of color represent, is that you know what this is. And it's not something that I can define by familiar shapes and forms. It's by color that you will recognize something, even if you can't describe it, you know what it is. And that's kind of what his fields of color are. It says he has climbed this ladder and brought it back to us and says, I know you've experienced something like this, right? So thank you for that. Margot.
Yes, with regard to Aaron losing his sons, I'm reminded of something my mother always used to say to me. Children are supposed to bury parents.
Yeah.
Parents are not supposed to bury children.
Yeah. Yeah. With that, I'm honored to call upon Wendy. Go ahead, Wendy.
Thank you. I'm glad she brought up the painting because I always see something in the painting that has to do with the Parsha. But in this, I'm thinking of the people. They appear to me as people who have lost something. They're thin. They're sorry. They have like, they've lost something because they're going in, right? And then if you've been on the subway, it's pretty dark, but there's some light to it that they can like maybe hang on to. Okay. And to me, it was just like a little warning or something, asking a question. Will you lose yourself while waiting for the subway to take you forward? So
Yeah.
kind of
So,
connecting it.
Wendy, thank you for bringing us back to the subway, because here in New York City, the subway has been a source of great fear lately. With COVID, people were not taking the subway, and then things seemed to open up, and then there was a terrible shooting in the subway in Brooklyn just last week, and so there's all this terrible anxiety about going down into the subway, even though people need to use it. And here in this painting, yes, these figures seem to have this incapacity to connect with one another, this terrible sense of isolation and alienation. And that isolation and alienation seems to be consonant with how compressed they are as human beings. And so this notion about being alienated and compressed, it's a terrible, terrible experience. And it's amazing that if that's what he was trying to convey, if that's perhaps what he himself was experiencing, and throughout his life, Rothko was haunted by all kinds of what we might call demons, and he ended up committing suicide. But if in the face of all of that, that he himself continued to evolve and move forward, and finally be able, in the late stages of his life and his artistic career, was able to share with us an expression of contact with something that was glorious and moving and healing and evocative. That is a great statement in and of itself. So thank you, Wendy, for that. And anyone else? Okay. So this is a moment of all kinds of counting is going on. We're counting either the days of Passover, or perhaps more correctly, counting the days of Hag HaMatzot. We're counting the Omer, and the trajectory of the counting of the Omer is to take us to something that is beyond who we are in the moment, to expand our experience and to expand and make us aware of what we can expand ourselves to be. And when we expand ourselves, the idea is to then bring all of that expanded self into this world. And that's what this notion of this Sefirah of Yesod is about, is to serve as a channel, to serve as a tzaddik, if you will, to bring that expanded self, that contact with something above our current limited self into this world. So, and that can really best be achieved not by isolating ourselves as spiritualists, which is one of the characters or archetypes in our midrash, but it's best achieved by being part of a community of practice, of a community of fellows who care about one another, who create a safe environment in which to explore what it means to be more fully our unique selves, and enabling us to each move forward in this world. So I thank all of you for helping to craft that kind of a community of support and well-being and encouragement. And God bless you all. Look forward to seeing you next time. Be well, everyone.
Thank you. It was
Right.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Have a good week.
You too.